Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Mothman horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story, The Mothman Cometh. I love horror stories and horror movies. This is my favorite subreddit, to boot. I wouldn't say total immersion has stopped me from being startled or scared when I see or hear chilling stuff, but I will say that I don't exactly get scared by the boogeyman. Mostly. There was one story that my friends told me when we were young. It was about the Mothman. I don't know what story you heard, but chances are it's a similar urban legend. It goes a little something like this. Somewhere in the world is a being who is almost human, appears almost human, except for one little detail. His eyes bug out of his skull like a moth's, and he craves the light in a similar way. If you leave your blinds up at night, there's a chance that one day you'll look over, and there the Mothman will be, hands grasping at the glass, trying to get inside to the beautiful glow of the light inside. That was the story my friends told me. I know that the actual legend has the creature more, for lack of a better word, creature-like, but I think the realism to their story was what got me so badly. From that point, until today, I don't even like to leave the blinds open during the day, just in case. Everything changed about a year ago, when my husband and I were getting in a tiff over why I didn't like him leaving the windows open at night. Apparently in the 3 years we've been married, and 5 years total we'd been together, I never mentioned my fear of the Mothman, but really, would you? What I realized that night was that I had actually forgotten why I was scared. Over time, you just become used to the status quo, I suppose, and never question why you do things that may be a bit off of the norm. Finally, I broke and explained that, crazy though it may be, I'm scared of this mythical figure. It was a revelation to the both of us, as I hadn't thought of the Mothman in years. To him, it was hilarious, because of my aforementioned love of horror and in all things scary. He couldn't believe there was any urban legend out there that got to me to such a degree. From that point on, whenever possible, he started to pick on me about the Mothman. Recently, we moved to California, which generally has been a fun experience, but our new apartment has a problem with one of the curtains, and it won't stay down. So, some nights, I come home, only to walk into my bedroom and discover that the window shade is wide open. I keep asking my husband to fix it, but he thinks it's funny. Thought it was funny. Last night, I came home and walked into the bedroom and the window shade was up again. I almost didn't even notice. I think I may have even been getting close to nipping that little fear of mine through exposure alone. So, of course, that was the night the Mothman finally came. I glanced up from my paperwork, and there in the window were 2 bright red eyes staring back at me. I screamed and slammed the door closed. And from there, it gets kind of sketchy in my memory. I know that I went into the kitchen, and I know I hid in the bathroom, no windows, of course, and I called for my husband. And I also know what you all are thinking happened next. I called, and he wasn't home. He was stuck late at work. So who was at the window? And thus our twist occurs. But that's not what happened. My husband was home. My husband was a funny guy. My husband just wanted to play a prank. Maybe I wasn't really getting over my fears after all. And I guess when I was in the kitchen I grabbed the butcher knife from the rack. But at least now the Mothman's dead. Second story. There's something wrong with my husband's paintings. My husband is a painter. Well, that's a stretch. He does very modern, Jackson Pollock-style art. I've seen him in the studio, and he's not so much painting as he is flinging paint at the canvas with his bare hands. Strangely, though, people pay real money for his work. His most recent one, gray and blue splatters on a gray canvas entitled Ocean Dawn, fetched us a cool $3,000. He makes a full salary off his work, and then some. I don't get it. Maybe the people who buy his work are smarter or more cultured than me. They all fit a very specific type. Well-dressed men with distinguished salt and pepper hair, petite blonde wives that look like they've never eaten a slice of cake in their lives. Money to burn, put on the dog types. Although, if it's a choice between one of my husband's paintings and a Louis Vuitton purse, well, his paintings are marginally less ugly than those purses. Man, what is it with rich people and ugly stuff? Anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent here. The reason why I'm writing this is because my husband has been away for the past 2 weeks visiting family. While he's been gone, I've been running the business by myself, and I've noticed some odd things. His studio is a really nice space downtown, large and full of light, filled ceiling to floor with his paintings. And even though they're individually ugly, there's something sort of beautiful about them being all together. The different colors and splattering types all match and coordinate with each other. It's obvious they're all done by the same artist. Maybe that's why he makes money off them. They have a distinct style. You can point to one and say, with certainty, that's a Theodore Waters painting. The thick globs of paint, the colors that don't really go with each other. That's a Waters right there. I could put on a smock and throw paint at a canvas while listening to Gregorian chants, too, but I wouldn't be able to produce paintings that consistently resembled each other in style. The first few days went well. We had a minor hiccup. I almost gave the woman buying Evening Tranquility the wrong painting. They looked identical to me, but I was enjoying it. After work, I'd head to the studio for a few hours and binge dramas on Hulu, waiting for the next client to come by. Things took a turn for the worse, however, on Wednesday night. My iPad ran out of battery 20 minutes before the last client was supposed to show up. So I just sat there, staring at the paintings. I got up and rearranged them a little. I pulled out the piece that was supposed to be sold tonight, Midnight Dream. It was one of the less ugly ones, if only for its color scheme. Black canvas, or possibly navy blue, splattered with purple, mauve, indigo, and white, and just a few dots of ocean blue drizzling across the front. I leaned it against the other paintings and sat back at the desk, taking off my glasses and rubbing my eyes. Damn allergies. When I looked back up, however, I froze. With my glasses off, Midnight Dream was now blurry. And with all the random splatters blurred now, I could see a clear shape. How there were less splatters, more darkness, in the center of the canvas. That looked exactly like the silhouette of a person. A person leaned over the viewer, staring down at them. What the? I put my glasses back on, but with all the clear dots and drizzles and specks, I could only barely make out the image. Was that why people were buying Theodore's paintings? Because there was a second, hidden image? It didn't make sense, though. I'd seen Theodore making some of these paintings. He was randomly flinging paint on a canvas, listening to those calming Gregorian chants, or whatever they were. There was no way he could plan where the paint fell to create a second image, unless he was somehow going back and painting over some of the paint splatters later. Though I didn't see any brush strokes to imply that. I got up and pulled out another one of Theodore's paintings, entitled Pink Marble, splatters of pink and red and white. I leaned it against Midnight Dream, stepped back, and took off my glasses. It was a hand covered in splatters of blood. My stomach did a little flip. I felt nauseous. It's just art, I told myself. People do extreme art all the time. What about that one where that giant guy is eating a man? That's like in an art museum and everything, right? Nothing wrong with painting a bloody hand. Nothing wrong with painting a shadow person glaring down at you. And maybe I was wrong. There wasn't much detail in these images, just the suggestion of forms. It could be pareidolia, my brain assigning familiar shapes to the paintings, like a Rorschach test. Maybe these were random blobs, and it was just my imagination. I took out another painting. This one was pretty ugly. Muddy shades of brown and green around the edges, a big pink blob in the middle. Spring Blooms was the title. I leaned it against pink marble and stepped back, closed my eyes, let out a breath, took off my glasses. I opened my eyes. Oh no. The pinkish blob, now blurred and at a distance, was clearly the shape of a woman's body, laying on the ground, splattered with blood. Why would he paint this? And who would buy this? Who would want a painting of a dead body in their home? I swallowed, my throat dry. I put on my glasses and slid the painting back in with the others stacked up. Was this the reason Theodore was actually making money? He was selling these paintings to sickos that were camouflaged well enough to stay hung up through dinner parties and visits from the in-laws. I texted the client who was supposed to pick up Midnight Dream and told them I wasn't feeling well. Then I drove home, stomach twisting, and locked myself inside. But I didn't exactly feel safe in the house either, because Theodore had a few of his own paintings hanging on our walls. I realized now, as I viewed them from a distance, that the painting in our living room depicted a close-up of a woman's face, but something black was oozing out of her mouth. Vomit? A spider? Not enough detail to tell. And the huge one in our bedroom, hanging above our bed, looked like two lovers embracing, except they appeared dead from the ashen gray tint of their bodies. This was sick, and it didn't even make sense. I remembered when Theodore painted this one, the one of the lovers. I had watched him for more than an hour. He was just flinging paint randomly as he listened to the weird chanting music he always played. Yet the blobby shapes clearly suggested two people embracing. I decided to sleep in the guest room that night. But before I did, I made the mistake of walking into Theodore's home studio. I'd left the lights on, somehow, so I stepped into the studio, my heart pounding. It was a lot more cramped than the one downtown. Only about 100 square feet, with a huge stack of paintings in the corner. As I reached for the light switch, I noticed the unfinished piece on the easel. I'd seen it several times over the last few weeks, but now I saw it differently. I took off my glasses and took a few steps back, out into the darkened foyer. It was a woman, lying on a dark wooden floor, splattered in blood. Except that woman was me. Of course I couldn't be sure. There wasn't enough detail. But from the colors, that looked like my favorite gray sweater. My hair splayed out on the floor. I backed away. Then I ran out of the house. I drove all night until I got to a friend's place. That's where I am now. Theodore has tried to call me, but I've let all his calls go to voicemail. Every time I close my eyes, I see the painting. The splatters of paint that look just like my dead body. Heard story. The Deep Woods Rain. Hello, my name is Erigi Fisher. My therapist advised me to write down what I've been through, so I suppose I will. It's been a week, and I typically have bad memory, but I still remember everything vividly, so damn vividly. I'll try my best to recount the details, but after all I've been through, I can't promise it will be good. Now, where to begin? It started with a trip I decided to take. I was getting exhausted and tired with people and society, and really just life in general. I decided I'd go camping in some deep woods. I'd rather not state the location, however. Apologies for that. There were beautiful, lush trees. I could hear the birds singing and animals moving about. The bugs were a bit annoying, but it was worth it. The way the light filtered beneath the gently moving leaves, the soft breeze coming in from the west, the light rustling of foliage as small animals moved. It was a beautiful sight. I took the camping supplies I packed out of the back of my truck, double-checked I had everything, and decided to head north, since I came from the south. There weren't really many paths here. It was just wilderness. In some back road dead end I decided I'd go to. I wandered for a while in the woods, making sure to keep a map on hand and a compass, tracing where I went. Eventually, I came across a nice-looking clearing. I cleared the area of rocks, debris, pieces of wood, and anything that would make sleeping rough. Then I set up my tent, a nice deep green small tent, just large enough for me and my travel pack. I checked the distance and time I'd hiked, and saw it was only about 1 kilometer in around 10 minutes. Just after, I looked to the sky to get a rough estimate of the time, and noticed the sun was beginning to set. On the other side of the horizon, I noticed a large amount of clouds rolling in. Just my luck. No matter what it is, I always seem to forget something. It's usually just one thing, whether it's a spice in a recipe, or in this case, checking the weather. I decided I'd take a walk around where I set up before going to bed. I spent around 30 minutes or an hour or so. I'm bad at keeping track of time, just slowly walking around, admiring nature, before I decided to return to my tent. As I approached, I felt like something was off. The closer I got, the more the feeling grew and grew. I was having trouble figuring out exactly what it was, but then I noticed. The tarp on my tent was slightly damp. I felt a little nervous, since I'm generally a bit of a paranoid person, so I quietly walked around the perimeter of my tent. I didn't see anything odd. Finally, I ended at the entrance and noticed that the door was slightly ajar. I cautiously approached, listening carefully. As I got close, my nerves started acting up. Stupid anxiety. I told myself to just shrug it off, but I couldn't. I don't know why, but I froze. I was scared something would be in there. I managed, after about a minute of standing still with one hand reaching towards the door, to open the front of the tent. Everything was normal inside. I let out a long sigh of relief and felt around. Everything was dry, apart from a small damp patch near the door. The sun was almost down, and it was getting darker. I decided I'd go to bed now, as the sounds of wildlife were shifting from diurnal to nocturnal creatures. I laid down in my cozy little snug sleeping bag, made sure everything was neatly organized, still in my bed, and went to bed. I awoke to the sound of rain falling. I'd recon a few hours later and felt a little groggy. I realized I had to go to the bathroom, which would mean having to leave the tent. I sighed deeply, part of me regretting my choice to camp, and I turned to go get my raincoat out of my bag. I always come prepared, even if I forget things. I paused as I shifted. Something didn't feel quite right. I listened to the sound of the rain falling for a while, before I noticed what it was. There was a wet splash coming from outside. I paused and listened carefully. I noticed it was following a pattern and sounded like large raindrops splashing in puddles. It was circling my tent, keeping the same pace while doing so. It was at that moment something else occurred to me. The raindrops on my tent were much lighter here and less frequent than those on the ground coming from the direction of whatever was circling my tent. The rain was very light, apart from in that one specific area. Slowly, I reached over to my bag. I always stored a small pocket knife in the side pouch of my bag for self-defense. I wanted to make sure I was protected when I confronted whoever or whatever it was. Maybe it was just a really wet raccoon or something, sloshing up the water. I slowly crept to the edge of my tent and paused. I waited for the footsteps to go behind my tent before I slowly zipped a small crack in the zipper so I could see out as quietly and slowly as I could. I waited for what felt like forever, but, as cliche as this is, was likely just a few seconds. I know that's something that's said a lot, but you really don't realize how accurate it is until you've experienced it yourself. I heard the footsteps approaching where I was peeking, and to my horror I saw some strange-looking thing. It was about the size of a human, but appeared to be made entirely of water. I couldn't make out too much of its features due to the darkness of night and clouds, but I did notice the shine of water and the dripping. I felt like I was being watched, like it knew I was here, like it was going to come for me sooner or later, or it was waiting for me to make a move. I slowly shifted back inside and started to breathe to calm my nerves. And hold out, pause. And hold out, pause. I started to focus again and, still listening to the sounds, slowly and quietly made sure to get myself in order, putting on my raincoat, getting my bag ready, and putting it on. I made sure I was holding my keys in a way that I could easily unlock my car when I got there. I waited for the thing to move in front of my tent. I watched as it walked by, and as soon as I was sure it wouldn't see me, carefully and quietly, but swiftly, opened the door. I took a deep breath, and as I heard it was on the opposite side, I thanked past me for facing the tent towards the car, and I started sprinting. Immediately, I heard whatever it was start chasing, and I heard the splashing of its footsteps. I heard my tent tear. As it ran through it, I'd estimate at the same pace as me, or ever so slightly slower. I couldn't slow down. I couldn't mess up. I ran through the trees, weaving my way through, and I heard several loud slaps of water against the trees, seeming like it didn't need to navigate through the trees. I was almost to where my car was when I tripped on a root and landed with a hard thump, catching myself with my hands on a rock. This was it. I was done for. I saw my life flash before my eyes, and I heard its weight shift, and I felt a massive amount of pain on my side, and I passed out. I woke up a few hours later in a lot of pain. The sun was out, and I could hear the wildlife. It took me a few seconds to realize I wasn't dead, and I immediately shifted over to check my bag and to no longer be face down on a muddy rock. As soon as I did, a searing pain shot through my right side. I looked down and noticed I was wounded. My bag was torn apart, my shirt with a large gash and bleeding. The wound was deep, but not too deep. I'm lucky it didn't kill me, but I felt lightheaded and hazy. The bleeding seemed to have stopped due to my shirt being slightly displaced, and the wetness causing it to cling to my body. I used my torn and broken backpack to cover the wound, grabbed as much of the contents as I could, and quickly headed to my truck. The windows of my truck were cracked, and a lot of the paint seemed to be damaged. I quickly found my keys. Luckily, they hadn't slipped out of my hand, and opened the door. I then dropped everything in the passenger's seat. I was about to go retrieve the rest of my items and equipment when I heard a soft splash. Splash! I immediately got into my truck, started the engine, and drove out of there, returning home. Before I was gone, however, I noticed a blurry silhouette in the rearview mirror. I decided I didn't want to see it more clearly. I relayed all of this to my therapist, and he suggested I say what happened. So, I guess writing it down did help a bit. I still worry that it's out there, but I know for damn sure I'll never get near it, and I'll never camp again. Fourth story.
Mothman in the Nicholas County Mountains.
Some years ago, I would go up to my grandparents for a couple weeks every summer to spend time with them and go to vacation Bible school. They live in the mountains of WV, and you can basically describe that place BFE incarnate. And own neighbors for at least every half mile, and it's as peaceful as all get out. I was quite the scary story and horror buff ever since my dad let me watch The Army of Darkness. This led to me being fascinated with everything having to do with monsters and cryptozoology. So when I found out my state had their very own monster, I was all about it. I would look everywhere for signs of something that isn't quite on the cusp of ordinary, possibly to a fault. This would follow me up to my grandparents with me, reading my book of urban legends. I was completely ate up with it. The first week went by all well and good. Then one night in the second week, I had something very strange happen to me. To this day, I have no idea what I saw. All I know is it was not normal. While I was there, I would sleep on their couch in the living room, which had the back glass door right behind it. In front of the couch was my grandpa's gun case that had plate glass doors on the front of it that would reflect anything behind the couch and outside the door. Now I want you to imagine waking up in the middle of the night with that field of vision. I had always slept with the TV on to distract me from my mind as I fall asleep. I wake up to the TV off and an engulfing pitch blackness. Half asleep, I look around and my eyes wander to the gun cabinet. In the reflection, I see two large floating, crimson ovals side by side. Needless to say, I'm freaked out, but I just can't gather the courage to move and look out the door behind the couch. All right, fuck it. If I'm doing it, I'm getting the hell to my grandma asleep in the front of the house. In one swift motion, I jump up and stare. For what seemed like an eternity, I stared into those red orbs. Finally, a synapse fired and I ran to where my grandma was. Panting, freaking out, confused. For some reason, I walked to the window that overlooks the woods across the street. Hesitantly, I peel back the curtains to look out. Across the street, in the trees, two red orbs. I am unsure of the amount of time that passed with me just staring at those two blood-red, glowing, oblong spheres when all of a sudden they just shot up into the sky. I woke my grandma up to inform her to what had just happened. She didn't think much of it in her sleep-riddled mind, I guess. I was just told to lie down and go back to sleep. There's all sorts of critters out here. Fifth story. Bird over Chernobyl. My mother's name is Vera Valerievna Kamenko. She just turned 83 this year. My name is Vanna Andreevna Kamenko. I turned 36 this year, and I currently work as a particle physicist. I was raised in Ukraine and then went to school in America at MIT, where I also did my graduate training. The same year, I was awarded a prestigious research position in Switzerland. The doctors diagnosed her with Alzheimer's, and the disease only progressed further. I've been losing a bit of my mother every day since. However, there is one thing she still remembers vividly to this day, and when I would help her bathe in the evening, she would grab my arm and tell me about the great catastrophe. Before the diagnosis, she would never mention what happened, though I was always curious. I was too young to remember, as I was still an infant, and everything I know came from what I learned in school and in documentaries. Nowadays, I would get little bits and pieces of what she and my father, who I never met, had to endure during that time. The following was collected and stitched together from my recollections of over a year of her telling me her story, little by little. She was 48 when the great catastrophe happened. The year was 1986. I was born in Pripyat, Ukraine. My mother was a pediatric hematologist working at Pripyat City Hospital No. 26, located at Druzhby-Neradov Street on the outskirts of Pripyat. She was a woman of sparkling intelligence, having scored the highest on her board exams in the Oblast, which according to her was what made my father, a fireman, fall in love with her a decade before. I was born in 1985, and for the year after, my mother was on her paid maternity to care for me. She told me that she began having nightmares beginning in March. It was terrifying, she recounted in Russian as I bathed her one night. Your father found me screaming and sweating. He asked me, "What's wrong, Vera?" And I was screaming, "The smoke, Andre, the smoke and the fire, and the people's faces disfigured and peeling from burns, Andre. I saw hell." Your father took me the rest of the night to calm down. I was so exhausted I could barely get up to nurse you, darling. My mother told me that she would get these nightmares repeatedly. It was more or less the same thing. A hellscape of smoke and fire with people's skins burning off and peeling like burnt paper. In our apartment complex, we soon found out that she wasn't the only one having that same exact nightmare. The neighbors who worked at the power plant also reported having these terrifying dreams. Yuri, who worked at the power plant, his wife told me over coffee one day that his husband has been waking up, screaming at night. I told her, what a silly thought. A grown man, screaming like a child at night? But she was completely serious. What her husband had dreamt, there was a look of sheer terror on his face that she never wanted to see again. When she told me what he dreamt of, the smoke and fire, I told her, that's strange. That was what I had dreamt of the night before and the week before that. The dreams became so intense that my father recommended she see a psychiatrist. When I went to the psychiatrist, Dr. Sitnikov, I believe, he wrote me a prescription for some benzodiazepine for my nerves. As I was about to leave the office with the prescription, he said to me, you know, it's strange that you had that dream. I've had people come to me this week describing the same nightmare you just described to me. I said, really? Has Yuri come to see you as well? And he responded, not just Yuri. 7 other men from Chernobyl have come to see me as well. What was strange was that by the second week of April, the nightmares suddenly stopped. That's when the phone calls began. One day while your father was at work, the phone rang. When I picked it up, nobody spoke. What I could hear was breathing, heavy breathing. I said into the phone, who is this? Is this a prank? Please don't call back. However, the phone calls came every other day. It was just 20 seconds of heavy breathing, no words, and then whoever was on the other end would just hang up. The next weekend, while she was driving home with my father from the cinema, she saw something that caught her eye in the distance. It was something floating above the trees. I couldn't see it very clearly from the car window. From the distance, it looked tiny. But if you factor in how far it was away, that thing must have been humongous. With the wings the size of a small building, or maybe a bus. I remembered that it instilled this primal fear and dread within me. I said to your father, look, Andre, I think there's something over there, above the trees. He said, over there? That's where the power plant is. He wouldn't believe me that I saw the winged bird with glowing red eyes flying circles around one of the towers. He dismissed me as being a woman with her delusions. But I knew what I saw. Yuri's wife reported that he had seen the same thing walking one night to the bus from work. Yuri's wife, she said to me, Yuri's been saying he's seeing this gremlin, some kind of giant winged bat with red eyes floating circles around block number 4. I tell you, he's playing some kind of game. I said to him, a giant winged bat with glowing eyes? Yeah, right, and I saw Baba Yaga at the shops last night. But he was completely serious, even scared. My mother remembers the morning of April 26, 1986, clearly, as though it was yesterday. I remember that night you wouldn't stop crying, so I was up at 1 in the morning trying to get you to sleep. It was a little before the half hour, and I suddenly felt the ground moving like an earthquake. It startled me so much that I nearly fell back. I feared there was a war that started, or maybe the Americans had dropped a bomb on us. So I ran to the window. I could see that coming from Chernobyl was this bright flash that quickly faded. Dogs were barking like mad around the neighborhood, and when the light faded, I could see this blue, glowing beam that just shot straight up into the sky like floodlights. My mother then got a call at 6 o'clock the next morning from the chief physician at the hospital. Dr. Vitali was on the phone, and he said to me, Comrade Dr. Kamenko, I understand you are on maternity leave, but something has happened. There's been an influx of patients from the power plant, and we are short on doctors and nurses. We need all the help we can get. I had to leave you with Yuri's wife while I grabbed my white coat and purse and left for the hospital. When I got to the hospital, it was bedlam. There were ambulances and people everywhere. People were helping men up the stairs. Some of the men collapsed on the stairs and were vomiting. They were still hauling people up on stretchers from the ambulances. When I got into the hospital, I could barely move through the doors. They were so crammed full of people. I said to Paulina, a nurse that was walking in with me, "Where did all these people come from?" "Something happened at the power plant last night," she whispered. "What? Was that what I felt?" I said to her, and she said, "Yes, I think there was an accident." Everywhere in the halls were men from the plant, still in their uniforms, with burned, soot faces and arms. It was a ghastly sight. I was treating this young fireman, and I recognized that his arms and face were covered in radiation burns. He was groaning in such pain and sweating so profusely. I asked him, "Where the hell were you to receive these radiation burns?" He could barely answer me, that poor fellow. He looked so feverish. I was putting out the fire. "We need to get these clothes off of you immediately." "Nurse!" I yelled. I waved to the nurses and they came and took the boots and coat off of the man. They then took them to the basement of the hospital to throw away. As they took off his jacket, I realized that he was in the same company as your father. I went to the head nurse and asked, "Have you seen Andrei? Andrei Yukimovich Kamenko?" A nurse behind her raised her hand and said, "Yes, I've seen Comrade Kamenko. He's in the burn ward in 28. I ran down the halls and up the stairs. Your father was lying in a room filled with other firemen and power plant workers. By then, they had set up these blue plastic curtains, and I had to go in to touch his skin. His skin was marbled and red, and they felt oily and damp with blood and sweat, and his lips were so swollen. The white sheets were stained yellow from his body. He looked like the horribly disfigured faces I had seen in my nightmares weeks before. He could barely breathe, and he just wheezed. He was in so much pain. At this moment, my mother fell silent and began to weep. "Mamachka, it's okay. You don't have to keep on going." Her eyes welled with tears. She sniffled, then continued. He couldn't even turn his head. I was there and I said to him, "Andrei, my beloved Andrei, look at you. What have they done to you?" And he spoke so hoarsely. Every word was painful, I could tell. "Vera, my dear, you look pretty today. The rocks, they were so hot and I'm afraid my hands are pretty burnt. How's my baby Vanna?" I remember that I grabbed his hand and smiled, though tears fell from my face. "Vanna couldn't stop crying last night. She was crying for you. Her papachka." "Don't worry," he said, coughing up blood. "Papachka will be home soon." He was delirious from the morphine. I was called back into duty soon after. That was the last time I saw him. The nurses told me he passed away a few hours later. We were later told on the state news on television that it was only a minor accident. Some block had been damaged on the roof of the power plant, and that rumors of a disaster were lies propagated by Western media. But I knew what I saw. I knew what took your father. It was like whatever had happened weeks before. The nightmares, the phone calls, that thing that flew over the power station. It was a foreboding, a harbinger of the hell that was to come. I know it. Yuri knew it too. He had been getting the same phone calls and saw the same flying bird. I was lucky, though. I heard from his wife a while later that he had died from the poisoning painfully and slowly several months after the disaster. Your father's body had not even touched the ground when we were told to leave Pripyat for a temporary evacuation. On the streets, we saw these long lines of buses. There were soldiers everywhere, and men and women with strollers with babies and school children. They were military trucks with speakers and this woman's voice telling us to close our windows and turn off our taps. There were other trucks with these men in white suits that covered up their entire bodies, and they were spraying the streets with water. I packed our belongings in a single suitcase, and with you in a stroller, we left our apartment block on Drusby Narrative for the buses for Kiev. We never returned. My mother still kept my father's picture, him in an Ushanka with a red star and his uniform, by her nightstand. The walnut frame was always dusted and maintained in a pristine state. I had never heard about what happened to him growing up, only that he died even before I learned to walk. A while after, I had decided to move my mother in with me to Geneva, Switzerland, where my new job was. You see, I was part of a multinational CERN-affiliated team that was conducting research on the origins of gravity and mass from quantum mechanics using microscopic black holes in the underground tunnels of the Large Hadron Collider. In my first week, I decided to take my mother on a free tour of the laboratories. I pushed her in a wheelchair as we went through the tour. She nodded along with the tour guide, and I pointed to where the white coat scientists were busy configuring data collected from the system. I leaned in and said to her, "Mamachka, I am going to be working here as a scientist." She grinned, beaming with pride. "Ah, that's marvelous, darling. Papachka is going to be so proud when he hears this." When we started walking back home, to the buses, it was already dark. I realized my mother's mood had suddenly dampened. She seemed to become quiet and fidgety, like something had deeply upset her. "Mamachka, is there something wrong?" My mother stared worriedly into blank space, then at me, then pointed to above the wooden dome of the visitor's center, her hand trembling. She stammered at first, then began to whisper. What she said next sends chills down my neck to this day. "And a bird. The flying creature I saw at Chernobyl. I just saw it flying around that dome." Sixth story. The creature of the dark forest. I have lived in Florida for my entire life. And during my childhood, I lived in a cabin with my family. My mother would always stay home while my father went to work. He was a hunter, until he was killed by a wolf when I was 10. Now that I am an adult, I realize why my mother called the forest that we lived next to the dark forest. I was sitting in the house that my mother lent to me and her well after she died of old age. She lived till she was 167, God rest her soul. I sat down on the couch with my good friends Ben and Jordan. They both watched the TV with me. It was on some old show that we didn't want to watch but was oddly attractive. Then Jordan got up and walked over to the window that pointed to the dark forest. It blocked all light that the sun was emitting. Then it started to storm. Thunder rumbled loudly. "What do you think is in there?" Jordan asked as he pointed at the forest. "There are wolves, dear, and other wildlife that I would rather leave alone," I said. Ben chuckled to himself. "There aren't wolves in Florida," Ben said. Jordan looked back out at the forest.
"Aye, Ben."
"Believe it or not, but there is a pack of wolves," Jordan said. Ben turned and looked at him with disbelief. "Bullshit," Ben said as he stood up and walked over to the window. I did the same. It was a pack of 10 wolves. When I was little there was only 3. I shrugged off the thought. "Well, I'll be damned," Ben said, fascinated. I smiled. Ben turned and looked at me. "Do they ever leave the forest?" Ben asked. I shook my head. Ben grunted in amusement. "Let's go in and study them some more," Jordan said with glee.
"No."
My mother doesn't call this forest the dark forest for no reason. My father was killed by those wolves. I don't want to end up like him, I said. Jordan raised a brow at me. You really gonna listen to your mama after she's been dead for 5 years? Come on, you're a grown man, not a little kid, Jordan said. I eyed him seriously. My friends barely see me angry, let alone serious. So, you can picture and almost feel the unease he had when I gave him my death stare. Look, David, this is a mysterious forest. Don't you want to see the secrets it holds inside? Jordan said. I sighed and nodded. Fine, but when I feel that something fucked up is about to happen, we are out. I yelled. Jordan smiled, and he slipped on his shoes. Ben did the same, as well as I. I walked to my room and opened the door. I got down on my hands and knees and lifted up some of the bed sheet that covered the space underneath the bed. I grabbed the shotgun and loaded 7 shells into it and stuffed 8 into my pocket. I then hung the strap over my right shoulder and headed out into the forest. That was the biggest mistake I have ever done. A couple hours passed, and we are very deep in the forest. Ben was amazed to see how tall the trees grew, how odd the flowers looked, and how different the animals acted. This is cool, Ben said with awe. We could see each other for the rain stopped and small rays of sunlight broke through small spaces through the trees' leaves and branches. Jordan nodded in agreement. It is very much cool. Why didn't you come in here again, David? Jordan asked me. I got down on my knees and looked at the ground. There were tracks, wolf prints, but something was odd about them. The hind legs were pawed, but the front had a human-like print, as if someone pushed their hands down into the grass hard enough to leave a mark. My father died here, I said, still looking at the tracks. Ben wandered further into the forest. Jordan ran over to him with me. Dude, what the fuck? Stay with the group. I yelled angrily. Ben turned and looked at me. Fear was in his eyes, but not caused from me. What? Jordan said. He placed an arm on his shoulder. Ben turned around and pointed at a small area littered with bodies. Human bodies. Some fresh, some not. I entered the circle. It looked small, but it wasn't. Beside from the human bodies, there were dead deer, squirrels, rabbits, and even bears. All of them inside out with one body part missing. The heart. What the hell happened? Jordan said. Ben was still in shock, staring at the death that laid before his eyes. The wolves, I said. I looked around us. They were there, but different. They were standing upright. They were long and lanky. Some had flesh hanging from their skin. They were humanoid. I grabbed my shotgun and shot it at one of them. They howled, but no. It wasn't a howl. It was a fucking scream. Let me paint the picture for you. Imagine 7 people screaming, but not the average scream. No, the scream that makes your heart sink. Now put all of those together and add in a disordered roar that sounds kinda like a laugh. Do you hear it? Now up the volume to over 100. That is the sound those fucking things made. They ran off but stayed close, roaring their terrible roars. I looked at my friends. Run, I yelled. They turned around and bolted toward the direction of home. I followed behind them. I heard the shrikes. They followed close. I glanced back to see one of them climb the trees and jump from tree trunk to tree trunk. I turned around and aimed my shotgun. After I pumped it back, I fired. The thing released a cry of pain as it fell and landed on a sharp rock, bursting its chest open. I turned around and ran like hell, my heart thumping, my legs hurting. I saw my friends. They were still running. Shotgun, Jordan yelled. I ran up close to him and tossed him the gun. He caught it and aimed at one of the things. He shot, but missed. The thing roared and ran off. He pumped it back and tossed it to Ben. He shot at the creatures too but missed as well. He pumped it back and tossed it to me. I caught it and turned around. 3 of them were after me. A cold calm took over me. I aimed the gun at one and shot. The bullets collided with its head, ripping its head open. It fell and slid across the forest floor. The two others spread apart and roared loudly. I pumped the shotgun and aimed it at the one to my left. It jumped back. I smirked as I quickly turned around, firing the gun. I didn't care if I didn't kill it. I wanted it to fuck off. Good thing it did. I pumped it again. We have 3 shots left before I hand to reload it. I shouted. Jordan and Ben were still running. Then why don't you reload it now? Jordan yelled. I nodded in agreement and turned the shotgun upside down and started loading bullets into it. I put in 4-4 before one of things roared loudly and almost hit me with its clawed hands. I jumped forward and pumped the shotgun and shot the thing. It roared as it fell down, busting its head against a rock. I pumped it back and continued running. When I turned around, one of the things grabbed Ben. He yelled loudly. My heart sank as I saw the creature pick him up and rip his jaw out. He slammed Ben's body down against a rock and started to eat him. 2 of the other creatures ran over and joined the creature. Keep running, I yelled. I ran up to Jordan's side. Tears streamed down his face as he looked back to see them continuing to eat Ben. We were almost home. I saw the cabin from the tree line. Almost there, but Jordan suddenly stopped. I stopped too, grabbed him, trying to pull him home. Run, David, Jordan said. I shook my head.
No.
I lost my father here, and I lost Ben. I'm not fucking losing you, I yelled. He pushed me away and ran at the creatures. I ran at him. 4 of the things looked at Jordan and roared. They bolted to him. Ah! Jordan yelled before they got to him. They tore him apart. I shot one of the creatures before I turned around and continued running. My legs hurt. My lungs felt like they were going to burst. I finally made it out of the forest. I stopped when I stepped out on the freshly cut grass. I turned around to being 3 feet away from one of the creatures. This one had a large scar over its left eye. It had black fur and black teeth with blood dripping from them. It opened its mouth and stopped without moving its lips. I love you, son, said the creature. It was my father's voice. Other than eating his heart, it ate his thoughts. Tears streamed down my face, and I fell to my knees. I will forever love you. Take care of your mother, and let her know that I love her too. Being your father was the best thing that ever happened to me, the creature said. I cried loudly. I grabbed the shotgun and aimed it at the beast. I looked into its eye and saw remorse, sadness, and regret. I put the shotgun down. It closed its mouth and nodded at me before turning around and running off into the dark forest. 7th story. Don't visit abandoned places. I think it has to do when we gone camping. It was her birthday, so I thought that was a good idea since she likes nature. And also the woods we were visiting have a lot of abandoned buildings and houses, even schools. My friend and I were just camping. We were also exploring abandoned houses. It was a hobby my friend and I like to do even though I'm often scared, and she tries to calm me down. One of the buildings was a big white house, but also some red and green colors on it. My friend said it was definitely blood. I thought she was joking, but she told me that the other houses also had BL00D if you look through the windows. I didn't believe her since I only saw a normal house that very bit scattered. But on the big white house were biohazard signs. Despite that, my friend wanted to go in. I first warned her, but she convinced me to go in. I think the place was for lab experiments since we saw a lot of BL00D and mini test tubes. But after some while I had an odd feeling. It was weird. The place looks weird. And it also smelled a bit rotten. So Elle decided to go out, but my friend still wanted to explore, and she was quite stubborn about it, so I let her explore. One thing you have to know is my friend is quite brave type of person. I, on the other hand, more reserved. I don't know if it even has to do with it, but something is telling me why my friend is sick and behaves so strange is because of that abandoned lab we visited. And I still feel guilty about it. After the visiting, she said she had pain in her leg. She told me she accidentally hurt herself in there, and so we gone home. But I decided to visit her, but my friend could barely talk. And she is very pale. I think she might has rabies since has foam in her mouth, I think. But for some reason it's still strange because rabies has usually incubation period for very long. And the foam was lightly yellow. I did call a doctor, but they said it's not a big of a deal. But I think it is my friend doesn't want to seem to eat anything. And I still feel like something is wrong. And I decided to visit a doctor. I wanted to take my friend, but she didn't want it. But the doctor said my friend is okay, but I should not go to her house all the time. And just let her heal. And it wasn't rabies. Despite what the doctor told me, I decided to visit my friend. Honestly, I don't believe my doctor. How can my friend heal on her own? She barely feed herself. Later, when I was walking down the streets, I smelled something rotten, and it was a similar smell at my friend's house. Despite me couldn't opening her home, I forgot to take her keys. But I smelled something rotten. And through the window everything was covered with BL00D. But also green and yellow color was there too. And then I saw the back door, it was open. It's weird, how can this happen? My friend was laying on her bed just before I was going to the doctor. And I decided to call the police. Maybe some criminal done something to my friend. The police told me they were already on the way because someone else called them before too. I decided to go away. Maybe the criminal is still around. I also had almost no energy left. Probably this whole thing was stressing me out. Weirdly enough, when I was looking through my window, my neighborhood were no single human, and when I opened my window it started to smell rotten. This is very weird. So I decided to call the police. They told me I should stay at my place and not go out. They found many bodies, including my friend's body, and my friend is infected with an unknown virus. And it's highly contagious. I felt shocked. Is that why I also started to feel sick? I looked in my mirror only to see how pale I got.